Thoughts after attending sung Evensong at King's Bollege, Bambridge. Bruce Charlton. I recently attended choral Evensong at King's Bollege, Bambridge, which is perhaps the most famous choir and choral venue in the world, thanks to its many decades of BBC World broadcasting on Christmas Eve. They certainly lived up to their reputation, with a beautiful sound and extraordinary precision of diction and intonation. I was particularly fortunate in that the music was provided by what are, for me, the very best of choral music, viz. That of the Renaissance era, including the English Tudor composers Byrd and Weelkes. The event provoked some interesting considerations. First, although it was a liturgical event in a chapel, it was not really Christian, but a high-quality classical music concert that happened to have free entry and a famously fine architectural setting. Consequently, a very high proportion of the very large congregation were tourists, and anyway I knew that the clergy and choir were not really Christian, but instead and inevitably mainstream Church of England bureaucratic leftist. They have to be, because otherwise such a lavish and high-quality event could not be provided, as it is, on almost a daily basis and for pretty much the whole year. This requires a colossal degree of planning, funding, and sheer organization that can only arise from institutions that are thoroughly, and successfully, embedded in the standard workings of the totalitarian state, with its vast monitoring and regulatory apparatus. As well as the upkeep and maintenance of the chapel itself, the running of a choral school, and its recruitment and training of boys and adult singer, is an enormous work in itself, with traditions and practices, spanning many decades, indeed centuries. The Evensong was therefore the culmination and continuation of a high civilization, which is itself absolutely dependent on the apparatus of the state. In the past, that state was Christian, officially, and to various degrees in practice. However, as of 2025 the UK state is integral to the global totalitarian system, with its overwhelmingly evil motivations, policies and plans. Even among the evil states of the West, the UK is striving to become the most destructive in a specialist fashion, terror, sabotage etc., on an international scale. Therefore, the beauties of King's Bollege Evensong come at a cost, and that cost is high, not only in terms of money and resources, but in terms of all the above. The cost is one of willing collaboration in systematic evil. Of course, these costs are not all evil, nothing is, and those within usually justify themselves in that basis, such as, in this instance, virtues such as the high aesthetic standards, and hard work. But overall, overwhelmingly, and increasingly evil, for sure. In order to be allowed, and enabled, to put on high-level aesthetic events like the Evensong I attended, the elements that go to make it possible, the university, college, choristers' school, all manner of charitable and artistic groups, must all consent to, and, increasingly positively endorse, most of that large and increasing range of ideological programs that characterize the modern state, and which are innately hostile to God and divine creation and of their essence, materialistic, reductionist, opposed to beauty and quality. There has been a Faustian bargain pursued by the academic and artistic establishment for many decades, by which the system has permitted aesthetic, but not religious spiritual, values to continue, including in a self-identified, Christian context in return for ideological servitude. But the scope of that aesthetic activity has inevitably been shrinking overall, and the materialist demands and value corruptions have incrementally escalated. Anyone who attends a church, university, art gallery, museum, theater, or concert hall nowadays, is far more likely to be confronted by crude political propaganda, than high aesthetic or scholarly values. If current motivations and belief realities persist, and trends continue, the only possible, hence inevitable, end of this process will be one of spoilage and destruction of all that is beautiful. There are many and powerful external factors that would annihilate King's Evensong very rapidly and completely. Such things have often happened before. But even without destruction from the waxing alien imperatives of many kinds, since the civilization that makes it all possible is now consumed by self-hatred and a covertly suicidal impulse. If it survives external destruction, then an end will come from internal factors. The paradox is that the many value inversions and materialist metaphysics that had to be embraced by those people and institutions who make a king's Evensong possible, are exactly what will ensure that it becomes impossible, and will cease to happen. On the appreciation of beautiful experiences, truth-telling, or moral acts. Doing good is not necessarily a good thing. Bruce Charlton. A problem we have, a real problem, is that doing good does not mean that good is done. Of course, in practice, this was usually only a loose-ish connection. But overall it made sense to talk in terms of virtuous or moral actions, of beautiful artistic products and performances of truths, from science, philosophy, history etc., that were valuable of themselves. But nowadays there is a very substantial disconnect, up to and including opposition between doing good, and being good. To be blunt, a lot of the generally accepted good stuff in life, especially the stuff that we get to hear about, is nowadays produced by people who are actively on the side of evil. This is a problem, and one that challenges the usual ways of thinking, not least because it often means that the bits of good which are done, are often/usually used for net evil purposes. Such has always been the most effective form of propaganda, for example is the elements of truth within propaganda that make the lies believable. It is the experience of beauty that makes the ugliness of the message seem appealing and convincing. Yet, at the same time, when the system/matrix/black iron prison mixes good with its evil, truth with lies, beauty with vileness, virtue with manipulation, it also thereby somewhat undermines itself. So the combination is unstable. On the other hand, at the level of institutions, things have becoming more evil for long enough to show that this is not enough to cause self-correction. There has been no pendulum swing back towards net good motivations. There are no grounds for complacency, and it seems entirely likely/possible that things will continue to get worse, as the underlying motivations of more and more participants continue to get worse. And when the civilization is totalitarian, as ours is, then any aspects of truth, beauty or virtue that require resources or organization, anything involving publicity or media, will normally and mostly be harnessed to the agenda of evil. Thus, in the spiritual war of this world, doing good, in an obvious and public way, is nearly all on the side against God, and that which is truly motivated by good tends to be invisible and unappreciated at a cultural level, may be known only among the circle of family or friendship. The situation is that there is still a sense in which truth/beauty/virtue are as real as ever they were, yet there is also a sense in which they have, in practice, been weaponized against God and divine creation. For this not to happen, and for public good again to evoke inner good, we moderns of 2025 must become more consciously aware of the situation, we must make discernments and choices. We need to be able to know what is good, and distinguish the good from the evil uses being made of it. Our thinking needs to be active and purposive, not passive, not dreamy drifting. Returning to my recent experience of choral Evensong. To give ourselves up to a contemplative appreciative state of immersion in external good, on the basis that external good can must and shall do us good, is actually, in practice, to open ourselves to manipulation and exploitation by the system of evil. If, instead, we yield to the overall experience like floating in a warm bath, half asleep, with eyes closed, we will be absorbing toxin through our dilated pores, even as our minds are beguiled. It is a matter of spiritual trust, and who can or should be trusted here and now. so long as there is a likelihood that the provider of good experiences is on the wrong side in the spiritual war, for so long we must aim to exercise continual discernment. And be ready to repent when, as inevitably happens, sometimes, we fail to do so. Deity is a person. Bruce Charlton. When I think back across my conversion from, almost, lifelong atheism to Christianity, it seems clear that the biggest barrier was that God the Creator is a person. Even in my youth I was prepared, even keen, to adopt abstract deistic principles, and assumptions about the directional or cohesive structure of reality. But the idea of the Creator as a person was an assumption that I ruled out, quickly, effortlessly, as obviously absurd, obviously childish. Yet now I regard Creator as person as an absolutely foundational and essential fact, and assumption. The absolute stupidity of totalitarian bureaucracy. Bruce Charlton. There is an absolute and ineradicable stupidity at the heart of the system, the bureaucracy that controls our totalitarian society. This is something that I observed firsthand in the year and a half I worked in the National Health Service Administration. What is characteristic of the stupidity is a conviction that because we need it to be so, then it can be so. When the system finds something necessary, then the system will believe that it is possible. Indeed, the system cannot comprehend that what it regards as necessary is actually impossible, because the system only takes regard of itself. The system is its own world, and works by assuming that itself is the whole world. So that when the system recognizes something as necessary, or even as simply desirable, then the system also automatically intrinsically regards that something as possible. We see this characteristic everywhere, or, at least, we can see it if we stand out with the system, which apparently not all that many people can or do, or even want to do. We see it at the large scale and at the small scale of bureaucratic operations. At the large scale there is the colossal socio-economic phenomenon of the global climate warming/change emergency, by which something not a problem, and anyway immeasurable, i.e. the temperature of the Earth/ocean surface/atmosphere is not measurable coherently, and which has unknown determinants, is claimed by the system to be understood, predictable, and controllable, by the system, down to fractions of a degree. So the system regards the climate problem as solved, and it is all a matter of implementation. On a smaller scale there is the current wave of AI, artificial intelligence, which the system believes it needs in order to exert what the system regards as the necessary degree of monitoring and control over the mass population. And the fact that AI cannot by its nature possibly work in the real world for such purposes, and therefore it does not work, is unknowable by the system. So the system regards the AI problem as solved, and it is all a matter of implementation. And implementation of such schemes is also something that the system knows how to do, to its own satisfaction, by the means it has generated internally. So that the actually accelerating collapse of social order and capability in the world outside the system, and that this collapse is actually caused by the system, simply does not register, because it is not part of the system. From inside the system, the only real problems are ones of implementation, the problem that people simply aren't properly doing whatever it is that the system currently wants them to do. Which means that the only real problem for the system is that of monitoring and controlling people. And thus the circle is completed. The specific instance when this became clear was when I was questioning a government minister in a meeting at the health authority. The NHS bureaucracy had set as a numerical monitored target, that national suicide rates should and would be reduced. I pointed out that this was nonsensical, because nobody knew how national suicide rates could be reduced. The minister rather impatiently explained to me that it was necessary that psychiatric services had a target, or else they would be neglected, and this was the only suitable measurable outcome, so now it was up to us to discover how to reach that target, i.e. how to reduce national suicide levels in line with the targets. In practice, the system generated some, totally conjectural, methods that it believed ought to work. These were accepted, eagerly, because something must be done. The hypothetical notion was, basically, prescribing more antidepressant drugs, because that must stop suicides, right? Ignoring that the SSRI drugs actually increase suicides, which was what happened in the real world. And so drug pushing was the policy which got implemented. At least until the system changed the targets, for reasons of its own. Note added, the above is a soft version of the systems theory of Nicholas Luhmann, which is summarized and developed in the appendix of my, pre-Christian, and leftist, book The Modernization Imperative. Was Boudicca's revolt originally intended as a distraction from the Roman annihilation of Druidry? Bruce Charlton. The story of Boudicca's revolt against the Roman occupiers in AD 61 is well known, and it is usually explained as having been caused by Queen Boudicca having been whipped and her daughters raped by agents of Nero. But another idea struck me while reading Geoffrey Ashe's History of Glastonbury, King Arthur's Avalon, 1957. Ashe emphasizes that the Druids were a major obstacle to Roman rule in Gaul, due to the proximity of the Druidic colleges in Britain, which Julius Caesar said was the center of Druidry. Druids seem to have been an elite and secretive caste, with a very long, 20-year, initiatory apprenticeship into an organization that combined many functions such as priests, prophets and augurs, healers and repositories of history and law. In sum, British society could not function without Druids. Ashe makes the plausible suggestion that the destruction of Druidry was in fact the major motivation for the successful Claudian invasion and occupation of Britain from AD 43. It is therefore very likely that Druid control and coordination was extremely strong in Britain, since they were the grey eminence rulers of the British regional kings, a national organization that bridged between the regional kingdoms. If their destruction was indeed the Roman aim, then from AD 43 onwards, the Druids were fighting not just to retain their power, but their lives. This danger to the Druids became potentially terminal in AD 60 into 61, when the Romans had pushed the Druids back into the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, off the north coast of Wales, and the Romans were preparing an invasion. The Romans then planned to invade and occupy Wales, thereby completing the conquest of Druidic Britain. My suggestion is that, as this threat to Druidry developed, and the Romans sent their legions to the northwest of Britain to attack Mona, the Druids sent word to Boudicca instructing her to start a rebellion in the southeast of the country. In other words, Boudicca's rebellion may have started as a military distraction, intended to divert Roman resources away from their plans to destroy Druidry. The Boudicca diversion, if that is what it was partially and temporarily successful. It did not save Mona, nor the Druids gathered there. Perhaps the rebellion was too late, or perhaps the Romans' anti-Druid strategic priority trumped their desire to save the Romanized populace of southeast England. In the event, the Romans were able to win their battle against Mona, invade the island, kill the Druids and everybody else, and burn the sacred groves. But thanks to Boudicca, the Romans could not consolidate their victory, not yet. The island of Mona was not occupied. The conquest of Wales was delayed. The legions were compelled to return to the southeast, where they defeated the Boudicca rebellion, which had by then grown to enormously destructive proportions. In their usual fashion, the Romans proceeded to crush the responsible populations, in order to deter and prevent any similar event recurring. But this took time and resources. So that Mona was not occupied by the Romans until another 16 years had passed, and mainland Wales was not occupied until AD 78. So, If Boudicca's rebellion was a distraction motivated by the Druids, it proved very costly and only temporary in effect. On the other hand, Boudicca did kill many tens of thousands of Romans, and destroyed Colchester, St. Albans, and London. And she delayed the conquest of Wales, and thereby probably delayed the final annihilation of the socio-political structures of Druidry, by a significant period. In sum, what I am suggesting here is that the causality of Boudicca, and the Druids of Mona may be the reverse of how these are usually explained. Traditionally, the explanation is that Boudicca rebelled because the Roman legions were occupied in the opposite corner of the country in destroying the Druids. The rebellion was allowed by the attack on Druidry. What I am instead saying is that Boudicca rebelled under instruction from the Druids, with the intention of bringing the Roman back from Mona, in hope of saving the Druids. The idea is that Boudicca rebellion was instructed, not allowed. She was not taking advantage of the absence of Roman legions, she was instead intending to divert the legions from destroying the Druids. Masculinity and femininity versus the actual person of Mother in Heaven. Bruce Charlton. While I assume that God is dyadic, a heavenly Father and Mother, this is something I have not really grasped, nor does it correspond much with daily experience. Partly this may be because we Christians are intended to relate primarily to Jesus, rather than the primary Creator, but partly it is because I tend to get hung up on inaccurate and unhelpful assumptions relating to principles, rather than persons. An example of an unhelpful/misleading conceptualization would be that of Coleridge's polarity between two contrary forces, the one of which tends to expand infinitely, masculine, while the other strives to apprehend or find itself in this infinity, feminine. One such assumption is that habit of thinking of male and female in terms of being specific exemplifications of those abstractions, masculinity and femininity. Abstractions that are somehow floating unattached beyond time and space, and sort of imposing themselves upon beings, as it were to make them men, or women. Really, things must be otherwise. Our heavenly parents are those two beings who, in actuality, not by any prior necessity, first committed to eternal love, and on that basis began divine creation. It is their two natures, originating as two beings, that ramify through all of creation since. Thus male and female both structure and power creation, but in this personal way, derived from actual living, conscious, developing beings, and not therefore in terms of abstract metaphysical forces or fields or tendencies. As always, with metaphysical realities, it is not possible to derive the metaphysics from empirical specifics, such as actual men and women, nor is it possible to derive any particular empirical specifics from the metaphysical assumptions. If the universe truly is derived from a dyadic God, then that universe includes everything that exists, has existed, or could exist, and this reality, this primary creation, in which we dwell, includes not just divine creation, but also entropy/death and purposive evil. What this seems to mean, among many other things, is that our experience of Mother in Heaven ought not to be preconceptualized in terms of an ideal earthly mortal mother, nor any other archetypal female conceptualization. Of course, if that is what we have decided in advance that we will find, then that is what we will find, and any female archetype really is there, but only as a selective, hence distorted, part of the reality. This stricture applies both to goddess conceptualizations, and to the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom I regard as ultimately a selective and distorted representation of the reality of the actual person of Mother in Heaven. Albeit the veneration/worship of the Mary, Mother of Jesus has, in some times and places, been very valuable as such, and emo far preferable overall to an exclusively masculine conceptualization of God. I think the difficulties of you and I experiencing the person of Mother in Heaven are therefore partly due to the nature of God the Creator, who is not personal in this world, in the way that Jesus Christ is personal, partly it is due to the ultimately dyadic nature of God, and the consequent difficulty of disambiguating father and mother, who are necessarily participating in each other, and partly due to our usually false expectations concerning what she is like. So, what is she like? The best answer is, she is like who she is. Which can be known, as here on earth, by personal experience, by getting to know a person. But she is not to be known in terms of exemplifying a list of supposed female attributes, nor can any list of attributes validly communicate her reality. AI in public discourse, it's a case of persons, or else nihilism. Bruce Charlton. God is personal, and human beings are persons too, and ultimately reality is a matter of relations between persons, or more exactly beings, alive, conscious, purposive, etc. Life in 2025 is pushing us towards either a clear recognition of this reality, or else a collapse into nihilism, then despair. Inwardly to reject the so-called AI push/takeover ought to be a no-brainer for a discerning Christian, but way too many have failed to recognize this latest threat, which means they have taken the side of consciousness denying abstraction, rather than personhood. AI is therefore a test. And, as with all the litmus tests, unrepented failure in one test strongly leads to further ramifications of the problem, to more sins of other kinds, and I sometimes observe a remarkably rapid collapse into general failure of discernment. To deny the qualitative gulf between AI and the personal, goes with a, typically optimistic, denial of the realities of our civilization. Once we have edited out the absolute necessity of individual human beings from our definition of discourse, inevitably, there will be adverse consequences spreading out from this unrepented failure, metastasizing, forming secondary spiritual dysfunctions. The problem is that to reject AI means to put oneself out with the mainstream, which is infiltrated and polluted with fake discourse. And it is trying to spread, all the time. Already this blog has experienced several AI pseudo-commenters. The answer is to reject the modern value of openness, including to become suspicious of strangers as being probably malign, in the same way that happens in tribal societies. Trust must be earned, including being trusted to be human and free, rather than mechanical and automatic. And therefore some humans will, in the nature of things, be rejected as AI, not least because many/most people in public discourse are already operating mentally, and spiritually, at the same level as AI, so as to be indistinguishable from an algorithm. But that is their problem, not mine. An increasing proportion of public media discourse consists of AI-generated text interacting with AI-generated comments, /reviews, /discussions. The truly pitiful thing is those human beings who are paying attention to it. A note on the static implications of divine omniscience. Bruce Charlton. I have harped on about the problem of regarding God's omniscience as necessary and definitive, and what malign effects this assumption has for Christians. I was thinking more on this matter, when it struck me with forcible conviction that omniscience is part of an assumption that reality is ultimately static, by which I mean that if God is to know everything, past, present, future, then divine creation must be completed and unchanging in an ultimate sense. The omniscience of God is a really bad idea for Christians, if not for strict monotheists such as Jews and Muslims, and insofar as omniscience is taken seriously and rigorously, it pushes Christianity, both in its deep theory and in societal practice, towards a pure monotheism by which freedom/agency, and creation/development are foreknown and bounded. Indeed, it seems logically to collapse towards a Hinduism or Buddhism that regards this experienced world of change, time, apparent freedom, apparent creation, as Maya, illusion, not really real. And this world of illusion is very difficult to square with faith in a God that is good and loving to us each as persons. Why would such a God, that is omniscient, create a fake world inhabited with deluded creatures? The omniscience of God is a really bad idea for Christians. Incoherence of theology is always a bad thing, especially when that incoherence is so upfront and obvious, yet denied and obfuscated by incomprehensible/nonsensical abstractions. Omniscience isn't explicitly stated in the Bible, quite the reverse. And is starkly contradicted by the eyewitness narrative and teachings of Fourth Gospel, and most of the other reported biblical accounts of Jesus. It makes me wonder what good reasons, there are plenty of bad ones, could exist why so many Orthodox Christian intellectuals, for so many centuries, have absolutely insisted upon such a monstrous doctrine, such a gratuitous stumbling block to faith in Jesus Christ. Prosperity Gospel Lite. Bruce Charlton. Everybody rightly makes fun of the pseudo-Christian preachers of a prosperity gospel, when their message becomes too crude, short-termist and monetary, for example those US televangelists who state that if you contribute to their church, you will get a better paid jobs, or such like. But the prosperity gospel in a light version is actually very common among Christians. I mean the belief that those who lead their lives in accordance with Christian beliefs and practices will survive and thrive in socio-economic ways. For instance, proponents of PGA may state or imply that being Christian will help you to have a successful business, get the girl/s, be a real man, attract admiration from real men, etc. And the flip side of prosperity gospel light are negative assumptions, such as get woke, go broke, and the assumption that leftist men are despised by the desirable girls. It is PGA to imply that conforming to the mainstream ideology usually leads to failure. The major theme of justification for the PGA is that Christianity is the truth, and that living in accordance with reality is likely to be more successful than a deluded existence of obedience to a false and virtual world. At root, all this is false, because it is a roundabout way of asserting that Christianity is expedient. It has never been true, except insofar as state Christianity was sometimes in some places, sufficiently powerful, true and uncorrupt, that a life of faithful church obedience could be a reliable route to worldly success. But in our current overwhelmingly atheistic, materialistic, leftist world, the expedient path of worldly triumph leads away from Christianity, at least over the predictable short to medium term. Optimism about success in this world is one thing, being Christian is another. Christians need to be clear about what their religion actually is about, primarily and essentially, and that is our positive desire and intent to attain salvation, resurrected eternal life in heaven. Implications about this mortal existence flow backwards from this post-mortal intent. There is no general reason why being a Christian would necessarily lead towards a successful, high-status, wealthy, comfortable, pleasurable, healthy, pain-free, mortal life, and indeed there are plenty of reasons why it would not. Shakespeare's Identity Revisited. Bruce Charlton. As happens recurrently, there is a resurgence of the argument that the bloke from Stratford-upon-Avon could not have written the plays attributed to William Shakespeare. This will never cease, because details of W.S.'s life are so sparse, because authorship in those days involved a great deal of copying and adapting, irregularities of spelling and nomenclature, and also because some of the lesser Shakespeare-attributed works are probably by others or done in collaborations, as has emerged in mainstream scholarship over the years, for instance the Passionate Pilgrim poems. Nonetheless, all the people that I have read who make this argument against Shakespeare, have been arguing from what I regard as false premises, as I have explained before. Firstly, Shakespeare is so much better than the second best writer in English literature, whoever that might be, which has always been disputed, that there cannot be any argument of a kind which suggests that Shakespeare of Stratford was incapable of writing something, but somebody else was. If we genuinely recognize the quality of Shakespeare, then nobody was capable of writing it, in the sense that there has never been anybody else in the same league. So no alternative identification as author is any more plausible than Shakespeare of Stratford. Secondly, the quality of the works attributed to Shakespeare mean that the author was a first-ranked genius, and it is not valid to apply the probabilities that apply to normal people to the work of a major genius. The example I used was Isaac Newton, another first-rank genius, but one whose life is well documented. It is striking that Newton's actual achievement is impossible on the basis of what is known of his life. The fact that Newton's achievement was not predictable on the basis of his biography, yet he did it anyway, is evidence that when dealing with major genius, normal predictions and probabilities are meaningless. There is, as I said initially, a mystery about Shakespeare as the author of the best attributed dramatic works. Yet I find the usual narrative of a grammar school boy from Stratford, from a rebellious, recusant Catholic family on his mother's side, and the rest of it, to be rich, coherent and satisfying. After all the caveats regards particular works or parts of works, to me, Shakespeare of Stratford rings true. Is Christianity a completed, fulfilled religion? Francis Berger.
Religious discussion centers upon the possibility of new revelation and a new spiritual epoch. All other questions are secondary. The new revelation is not at all a new religion, distinct from Christianity, but rather the fulfillment and completion of the Christian revelation, bringing it to a true universality.
The excerpt above is from Nikolai Boudieff's The Destiny of Man, and the idea it expresses resonates deeply with me. I cannot accept that Christianity is a completed and fulfilled revelation. To accept that is to admit that everything is set in stone and that our main task is to live within the shadow of such knowledge and pray for the second coming, which will tie up the messy, loose ends of creation and set things right eternally, once and for all. I am not sure what Boudicca means when he speaks of the new revelation providing true universality to Christianity. However, I am convinced that Christianity is in dire need of new revelation and that it is very far from fulfilled or completed. Convictions of that sort do not sit well with Christians because they regard their religion as fundamentally completed and fulfilled. New revelations are unnecessary, nay, more than that, metaphysically impossible. Everything that needed to be revealed has been revealed. To claim otherwise is blasphemy and heresy. In The Destiny of Man, Boudicca also notes that
the opening of a new epoch of the Spirit, which will include higher achievements of spirituality, presupposes a radical change and a new orientation in human consciousness. This will be a revolution of consciousness that hitherto has been considered as something static. The religion of the Spirit will be the religion of man's maturity, leaving behind him his childhood and adolescence.
I believe that Boudicca is on the right track when he claims that the completion and fulfillment of Christianity are intrinsically linked to a revolution in human consciousness. Such a revolution can only occur if one assumes that human consciousness changes, develops, and evolves. That divinity reveals itself and seeks to be understood through the development of human consciousness. Christianity proper very much regards human consciousness as static. Man is as mature as fallen man can ever hope to be. The only thing fallen man needs to do is orient his fallen maturity in the right direction and obey the absolute God. Everything else is just metaphysical soap bubbles. Nonsense. Christianity proper believes that man understands God as best as can be understood. Man cannot expect to discover or perceive any new revelation because God has already revealed all that needs to be revealed. Since human consciousness is static, man must not fool himself into thinking he can understand or know God better or in any other way. Man can fiddle with doctrine and hone old theological formulas, but he must not expect any new revelation because none are coming. Any suggestion of new revelations is a misdirection and spiritually fatal. Most Christians eschew any hint or possibility of new revelation and are perfectly content with incompleted and fulfilled Christianity. I have no interest in contesting such an eschewal, and to such fulfilled and completed Christians, I say, peace be with you. As for me, I am more at home in a Christianity that is incomplete and unfulfilled. A Christianity that not only thirsts for new revelation but positively requires it for God's overarching creative and divine purposes. A big part of that new revelation involves recognizing that God did not and could not have created ex nihilo. The assumption that God has the power to create from nothing has always been a bad one. As the product of an earlier mode of human consciousness, it is somewhat understandable, perhaps even forgivable, yet as an absolutely insisted upon and unchallengeable eternal Christian truth, it is both incomprehensible and obstructive. Remove creatio ex nihilo, and Christianity's lack of completion and fulfillment become too glaring to ignore. The causes of gratuitous wars. Bruce Charlton. It is fascinating, as well as alarming, to see the British political system, bureaucracy and mass media, combining forces to justify and escalate full war on behalf of a remote and disconnected not ally, including explicit and repeated demands for rearmament, a war economy, and mass military conscription, something not seen here for some 70 years. The same is happening over most of Europe. And this has been building up for nearly 2 decades, by lies upon lies, gradually building up the image of a necessary cartoon supervillain that must be fought, or else we shall all be doomed. Or rather, even more doomed than we already are by the nakedly evil plans of our national rulers. There have been many gratuitous wars throughout history. One of the most famous is that described in Shakespeare's Henry V, which is depicted as having been due to an insulting gift of tennis balls. Much more likely, the war was proximately due to the multi-generational yearning of England's usurping Norman kings to rule in their native France, a country they have always, and still do, prefer to what they regard as the uncouth English. The tennis ball incident was just an excuse to justify something Henry wanted to do, like happened again in World War I and World War II, with their pseudo-altruistic, but not actually done, excuses of saving Belgium and Poland. Plus that the Normans were addicted to war as the supreme form of sport, and they were usually very good at it. That kind of motivation doesn't really persist in the West now, yet the current leadership class of the UK and Europe are very keen to engage their nations in all-out gratuitous war. There are similarities between past European wars and this current one, but also there are enormous differences. One difference is that current national and regional leaders altogether lack the personal prowess, courage and decisiveness of an heroic character like Henry V. They are, indeed, both pathetic and despicable individuals, and collectively. The leadership class has for decades been marinated in a cultural soup of pacifism and suicidal altruism. Also, the mass populations of the West nowadays are, to put it mildly, not longer trained for war, no compulsory longbow practice. The military have low status, and do not appear in public in uniforms, and have been thoroughly demoralized by atheism, materialism and cultural destruction. The Western masses are by now docile, distracted, self-destructive, utterly repelled by the idea of war insofar as they even think about it, which is very little. Yet, as so often, the justification for such a war is gratuitous, profoundly unnecessary, without any possibility of average overall national benefit. Therefore the need for war must be built on long-term, systematic deception and untruthfulness, and lying misrepresentation of the actual purposes. What interests me is the different motivations that seem to be operating at different levels of the system. At the lower and middle levels, the managerial and intellectual classes, the push for war seems to be just another manifestation of their system of incentives. Such people behave in ways that they believe will provide them with the greatest prosperity, security, and status among their kind. When the system is set up such that supporting war is advantageous to such persons, they will support war, in the usual way that they support any other system priority such as sustainability, anti-racism, equality, that is to say, they approve and develop and inhabit bureaucratic structures and processes, which are supposedly directed towards that end. At a higher level, say, that of national leadership of large institutions, organizations, corporations, there is need for individuals who will actively construct false narratives, suppress truths, engage in multiple immoral and illegal activities, so at this level the motivations need to be cruder, more personally corrupting, more consciously sinful. These middle leadership level people need, at some level of awareness, to give their allegiance, or at least their obedience, to the strategies of evil purpose. This is why we can observe their personal corruption, their strange emotions and reactions, their snake eyes or zombie eyes, all evidencing that they have been through some kind of shock and awe, brainwashing, blackmailing, or spirit breaking, that guarantees their allegiance. For such people, engineering gratuitous war is just politics as usual. Plus, war has a direct personal appeal of providing for greater opportunities for power grabbing, abuses with impunity, enacting revenges and torments, self-enrichment and self-gratification, and such like abuses, which are always made easier by war. Beyond this level of societal control and warmongering, I am not aware of the identities of human personnel involved, and the spiritual powers, demons, become dominant. And because these are unembodied spirits, their motivations are different from those of humans. These spirits with direct affiliation to the side of evil are primarily engaged in a spiritual war. The realities of spiritual warfare are strategically focused on the damnation of men in accordance with the motivation of their leader, i.e. Satan, but also are tactically motivated, more individually, in the shorter term, by a kind of vampirism of spiritual energy, an enjoyment in feeding off the evils of the human condition, and from the destruction of souls. At this highest and more strategic level, the purpose of war is very different from that of national leaders. For instance, the strategist's ideal is a war that is unwinnable, interminable, and constantly escalating into greater extremes of mutual destruction, resentment, lying, and despair. Such a war would be intended to include as many as possible of the national leadership class who engineered it, as well as the managerial/intellectual class who justified it to the masses. Indeed, these bureaucrats of war, i.e. the national institutional leaders etc., provide greater spiritual energies to vampirize exactly because they have given their souls to evil, than would the unwilling, unenthusiastic, driven masses who would experience the greatest sufferings and casualties. There can be no political right, so, what instead? Bruce Charlton. I have often noted that there can be no political right that is genuinely distinct from the left, unless it is rooted in religion. In other words, what people call the right, including the far right, whatever that may be, are from a Christian perspective and at root, just a type of leftism, that is, they are all this worldly and aiming at hedonic outcomes, i.e. human psychological gratification. I believe this is true, and consequential, but whereas 15 years ago I saw religion in terms of a church, now I regard it as unavoidably personal, romantic Christianity. So how then does religion work as an alternative to the pervasive leftism? The answer is that the real alternative to leftism is much, much more radical than anything ever dreamed of by any kind of the right. The right tries to keep what it likes from our leftist Western civilization, and eradicate what it does not like, but romantic Christianity recognizes that this process must cut very deeply indeed to eradicate the roots of evil, so deep, indeed, that our kind of civilization seems inconceivable. What would happen instead is also inconceivable in detail and at large, except that it would be more like a family than a state. However unsatisfactory this individualist/romantic worldview may seem to be, especially to those whose ideology continues to be socio-political and groupist in nature, it does seem to be the only positive, Christian, possibility, given the way that human consciousness has developed. Feminism is not about equality. William Wildeblood. This is a subject I return to now and again because it lies squarely at the heart of the modern deviation. It's not the cause of the deviation. That is the rejection of God and the natural order of creation, but it is one of the major symptoms of it and a big contributory factor to the ongoing rupture from reality. Feminism is not about equality. It may have seemed so at one time, but actually, like many movements claiming to be for freedom and equality, what the impulse behind feminism sought was power. The desire for power is not in itself bad because the ability to exercise power is part of our divine right, but why do we seek power, to what end? That is the point, and the feminist desire was and still is to control men, to be the one in the driving seat. Now you could throw this accusation right back at men and say that they wish to control women, and this is why they seek headship over them, but there is this difference. The male desire to lead the female, to be, archetypally speaking, the lord to the lady, is based on natural justification. This is because in spiritual terms the male represents the creator and the female represents creation, as is illustrated in simple but profound terms in the book of Genesis. Creation came out of God just as Eve came out of Adam. The fallen female desire to dominate the male is the desire of a created being to usurp the role of the creator, which is why we can accurately call the inspiration behind it satanic. These may seem hard words, but they are necessary because they are so widely denied. They do not mean that the male is intrinsically superior to the female in individual or collective terms, but each sex has its role and should not seek to appropriate the role of the other. Nor do they mean that the power the male has over the female is for his own personal ends. That power is inseparable from responsibility, and should be exercised with love, just as it is with the Creator and the creation which is his bride. To be sure, there are different masculine and feminine types as is depicted in mythology, with different types of gods and goddesses, and the relationship dynamic will not always be the same, but still the basic pattern remains and should be respected if a society is to function creatively and harmoniously. The great spiritual deception of the 20th century was that progressive and liberal ideas were precursors of the spirit of the New Age or Age of Aquarius, and that the more advanced parts of humanity would adopt them, with the spiritual laggards rejecting them. In fact, these ideas are not connected to a new age so much as they are symptoms of a decaying old age. Far from being spiritual advances, they are indicative of spiritual collapse, arising when material concerns take precedence over spiritual ones. The equality of the sexes, the very idea of equality itself, is an example of what comes about as the old age falls into decay. It arises from decomposing elements of the past, not from glimmers on the horizon of the future. That having been said, feminism has made the inroads it has because there is an element of truth to it. Over the last few centuries human consciousness has been changing, becoming more aware of the self, of personal autonomy and freedom, and this has affected both sexes, which both need to express the new awareness. In a sense, you can liken this to adolescence, which would imply that what underlies feminism is at the same time a need to become fully individual, and a form of adolescent rebellion. So, good and bad. The problem here is that the rebellion has gone unchecked and then been justified or rationalized as a good thing instead of understood as the negative aspect of a growth process which should be got through and grown out of. Thus, one could say that we are in a period of arrested development. We have rebelled against our divine parent, and the natural order of being. Women responded to the need to become fully individual, but did so from the perspective of the ego rather than the soul. In the latter case, the response would have been in the context of spiritual understanding and not entailed rebellion against God and man. As with many ideas now firmly entrenched in the modern mind, it's hard to see how we can get back to where we should be from where we are now without complete societal breakdown. Things have gone so far that only when we no longer have the luxury of a full stomach and a roof over our heads will we let go of our illusions and be prepared to fall in with how things are, as opposed to trying to force them to be how we want them to be. This has been necessary in the past and will be so again. It is why we need to start preparing for a future when all our assumptions will be challenged at the deepest level. We will be stripped bare and we have only ourselves to blame because we have rebelled against reality. We are not alone, objectively, but subjectively, we are alienated. Bruce Charlton. Modern alienation is a very real thing, which is to say the experience of being cut off from God, reality, this world, other people. Is inescapable as a subjective experience, and this has profound religious, social and political consequences. Yet alienation is an inwardly caused phenomenon. Alienation is not a reality imposed by the external nature of things. We were all spontaneously and involuntarily, and most unconsciously, immersed in everything else at the early phases of our existence, and that is the primary reality of divine creation. It could be called a complete web of interconnectedness, except that connect assumes that we begin as separate, and must overcome separateness by connecting. The reality is the opposite, we begin as only partially separated in our awareness from the oneness of divine creation. That is the baseline. We modern men are now alienated because in the course of human development we have each cut ourselves off from that spontaneous immersion in everything else. The barrier arises from within us. That barrier which cuts off modern adults can be, and is at times, dissolved, or demolished, for instance by dreaming sleep, mental illness and brain disease, intoxication, or sometimes by meditation. But all of these make us dysfunctional, and none of them succeed in restoring the natural spontaneity of an earlier phase of consciousness. The earlier phase of spontaneous immersive consciousness is like the childhood phase of development, such that once an individual has developed beyond childhood, childhood can never wholly or healthily be re-established. In other words, we should take the cut-offness of modern alienation as a fact of life and the basis for further developments, yet we also need to bear in mind that the ultimate reality is, as it always was, one in which we are naturally and inescapably immersed in reality, including the reality of the divine, of the universe, of other people. Therefore we do not need to connect because disconnection is not the problem. Instead, the problem is in our own consciousness, which is stuck in a phase that denies the reality of its immersion in the whole of divine creation. What we need to work on is our own personal consciousness of reality. We need to become conscious of that we are currently not conscious. Modern man usually denies the reality of that of which he is not spontaneously conscious, such as the divine. That is, we deny the reality of God because we moderns are no longer spontaneously and continuously aware of God, as was once the case. I am saying that we need, instead, to acknowledge the reality of our connectedness to immersion in the divine, and from that conviction strive to become conscious of the actuality of this link. Acknowledge reality, then strive for awareness of that reality. To put it differently, we modern men have, under God's will, developed alienation, which is an increasing individual independence from the whole, and this development has happened because this is also a greater freedom and agency. In other words, the universal awareness that was once spontaneous and inescapable, is now voluntary and chosen. What is needed is not a return but a development. So, this voluntary and chosen acknowledgement of connectedness to other people / the world / God is a new thing, a deliberate step forward, not a surrender or relaxation backwards. A doing, not an undoing. Because new, the needful awareness is subjectively experienced differently from the old childhood or childlike consciousness. We need to be self-aware, aware of our own awareness. This is not under compulsion nor necessity, this is something that we are aware that we have chosen, and that it could have been, could be, otherwise. From such a perspective, all looks different. We know what we know via our subjectivity, that is, our subjectivity is part of all possibilities of knowing. Subjectivity makes everything possible, and a change in the nature of our subjectivity affects everything. So a deliberate attention to developing consciousness makes a profound difference to everything, including our experience of Christianity. Modern alienation is therefore meant to be just a phase en route to a higher, more developed, indeed more divine, form of consciousness. Lady Day. Bruce Charlton. It seems worth noting that this is Lady Day, March 25th, officially the Feast of the Annunciation, commemorating the day that Jesus was conceived on his mother by the Spirit of God. Lady Day was greatly celebrated in Merry England, and was indeed, until 1752 and the imposition of the Gregorian calendar, when it was moved to the 6th April, the first day of the new year. Coming 4 days after the vernal equinox, Lady Day has the same kind of astronomical basis as Christmas has in relation to the winter solstice, and thereby links with natural religion. England in the Dark Ages and Middle Ages was known for an especially high degree of devotion to Mary, probably something that came via the Celtic Church, with its many links to Constantinople, but was powerfully sustained over many generations. It was a day for various kinds of religious celebrations, and also a day on which fairies might be seen, suggesting a distinctively Celtic harmony and synergy of the pagan and Christian forms. Lady Day is timely because such matters are much on my mind, in particular the question of the underlying spiritual reality, rather than the theological superstructure, of Christian devotion to Mary, which strikes me as overall a good thing, however critical I am of most of the details. Devotion to Mary seems like a corrective to the abstractions of orthodox monotheistic Trinitarianism, and a heartwarming of Christianity, as well as recognition of a fundamental and metaphysical reality. It also seems like a part of England's destiny and the destiny of the English, in some rather obscure way, that I think needs elucidation and therefore deserves a greater effort of understanding. Pride and Paragons. Francis Berger. Christians who question or challenge orthodox/traditional/conventional ideas. Arrogant, spiritually prideful individuals who require humility. Christians who pugnaciously and unrelentingly assert that the orthodox/traditional/conventional ideas they champion are the only possible Christian truth. Paragons of spiritual humility. Motivational speakers, or writers, Edward Dutton on Jonathan Bowden. Bruce Charlton. I recently read my old colleague Ed Dutton's biography of a radical right political figure called Jonathan Bowden, 1962 to 2012, which has just been published. I had never heard of Bowden until after he had died, and was not interested by what I discovered. His ideas were seemingly derived from the same kind of, fundamentally deficient, based, reactionary, nationalistic, Nietzschean, this worldly and hedonically calibrated non-religious sources as are always knocking about on the internet, ideas capable of generating a little bit of light, but no sustained heat. So it seems that JB was not an original or coherent philosopher, it was not what he said that made him distinctive, but how he said it. What was of general interest about Bowden, as Dutton presents him, is that he was an orator of genius, a live public speaker who was capable of inspiring and motivating people in a remarkable way, so that those present retained the influence for a long time afterwards. It seems that the inspirational effect was sufficiently objective that Bowden has developed a posthumous following, based upon videos of his speeches. Ed describes him as a shaman, to emphasize the strong magical spell that JB cast on his listeners. The other striking aspect of Bowden was that he was a long-term and wide-ranging self-aggrandizing liar about almost everything to do with himself. This was very extreme, and while his friends and colleagues realized that Bowden was prone to exaggerate and fabricate, apparently none of them realized the sheer scope and depth of his dishonesty. As well as all kinds of stuff about a constellation of false academic qualifications and intellectual attainments, perhaps the strangest lie was a highly elaborate construction about being a wealthy and successful businessman, with a wife and 4 or 5 children. Bowden provided people with all kinds of everyday details and specifics about the family's history and current doings, when the reality was that Bowden was never married, never had a job, and subsisted on a very small income from his father and benefits, probably never had a girlfriend, and lived alone in a rotting caravan. This strange story makes me think about the role of motivational speaking, and by extension writing, the considerable extent to which we seek and rely upon this. And how there are some people who are exceptionally gifted in this direction, and in ways that seem to depend extraordinarily little upon their actual attainments, or the content of what they are saying. On the one hand, it is striking how highly valued is this ability, how grateful people are for being stirred up and given confidence and direction. And on the other hand, how little substance is needed for this to happen, or even how that substance may be vague, impossible, or incoherent. It seems a fact about humans that we desire to be inspired by others, no matter or unworthy or flimsy are those chosen, none of which seems to make a difference to the intense loyalty and affection that are directed at those capable of doing such inspiring. As Dutton analyzes it, this is what Max Weber termed charisma in a leader, and charisma can, to some extent, be associated with a variety of adverse and undesirable experiences and personality traits. Nowadays, charisma is mostly artificial and manufactured by the machinery of advertising, public relations, propaganda and saturation mass media coverage, so that someone without any exceptional degree of genuine charisma can be passed off as a shaman. Just as the public can successfully be manipulated to react to very ordinary-looking actresses and actors, pop stars or other public figures, as if they were truly beautiful, handsome or sexy, or can be induced to regard mildly competent, socially conformist and ideologically mainstream pundits or writers, as if they were towering intellects, path-breaking radicals, or creative powerhouses. But there is also such a thing as real interpersonal charisma, that does not depend on anything except human presence and the human voice, and this real thing was apparently what Jonathan Bowden had in spades. Let me be clear, traditional Christianity is now always and all the time dishonest. Bruce Charlton. By my evaluation, traditional Christians are being consistently dishonest about what their faith actually entails. They talk and write that real Christianity is about humble obedience to the obvious and necessary truth of that external authority which is the church. Meanwhile, all the time, top to bottom they are making personal subjective choices. They have chosen their church, chosen to regard it as the real church, the true church, the necessary church. They have chosen the evidences by which they argue for all these, they have chosen how to interpret these evidences. They have chosen which among the leaders and administrators and practitioners of their church they will regard as true and worthy of obedience, and conversely they have chosen which voices are heretical, wicked, foolish etc. They have chosen what is vital and significant among sins and virtues, and on a daily basis they choose how to live their Christian lives among the almost limitless possibilities. These are just facts about religion, about Christianity, here and now, as it actually is. They have been and are exercising personal choices all the time. And speaking and writing about the need for humble obedience to the obvious truth of their church, as if that was possible, makes any difference to the facts. It is therefore dishonest, in denial, and grossly misleading. To have an honest and relevant discussion, it is first vital to acknowledge the realities, and the reality is that not a single person in the West actually practices the humble, obedient, church-led religions, so insisted upon by traditionalist Christians. They do not, and neither does anybody else, and it is impossible. Such plain facts of Christian living ought to be the agreed and basic starting point, if what is desired is coherent and helpful discussion. Perhaps a womanly and procreative aspect of God is necessary for a solid belief in eternal life. Bruce Charlton. I am rereading Jeffrey Ash's fascinating study The Virgin, 1976, which is focused on Mary, Mother of Jesus Christ. Ash was a Roman Catholic, but takes in the broader perspective of goddesses throughout history, in a non-hostile, indeed sympathetic, fashion. He makes the stimulating suggestion that a goddess was primal in ancient spirituality, because she was the assumed basis of the procreative hence creative, and that some form of female deity is needed for men really to believe in a life beyond life. The idea is that a supreme male deity cannot sustain belief in a full life beyond life. So that when the ruling goddess goes, the afterlife becomes very partial, ghostly, and all but irrelevant.
Male deities could never bestow life of their own nature as the mother had done. Zeus and his colleagues were immortal, but they did not transmit that quality to their human subjects. Through most civilized and semi-civilized lands, death ceased to be a passage to a future life. The dead were no longer pictured as significantly existing. They were reduced to feeble, bloodless shades in a gloomy underworld. For the Greeks this was Hades. With the fading of the eternal womanly, with her cutting down or anathematization, for the vast majority, with extremely few exceptions, death had become the end with no prospect of rebirth. Israel's shift was similar. The Old Testament has no doctrine of survival or return. The dead become shades. They do down to an underworld called Sheol, the grave. The sole Israelite immortality is collective. God's chosen community.
I think it likely that Ash is on to something here. In the book, Ash is preparing the ground for an attempted explanation of the rise of Mary the Mother of Jesus as a more and more important focus of Christian faith, recognizing that this phenomenon cannot be accounted for by Scripture, or by the practices of the earlier generations of Christians. With Mariolatry, Ash says, we seem to be dealing with some kind of deep and direct apprehension of spiritual reality, probably coming from grassroots, bottom up, the masses. Christian leaders and theologians seem merely to have been trying to explain and validate theoretically something that already was beginning to become important in practice. From my own experience, I find it striking that Mormonism included a very strong element of the eternal womanly with its dyadic deity composed of Father and Mother in heaven. And, perhaps in consequence, the Mormon culture of salvation was, at least until fairly recently, probably the most vividly lived and believed in form of Christian afterlife among the major Christian churches. The spiritually unsatisfactory and unconvincing nature of one-sidedly masculine Christianity is something I find very striking. I mean the monochrome hardness, negativity, heartlessness, legalism and this worldliness of Mary rejecting forms of Protestantism is something I feel is very evident. It is one reason why England ceased to be merry with the Reformation. But there is something of this in all of Christianity. And this defect has not at all been ameliorated, let alone cured, by the dominant trend towards secular materialism in all the Christian churches, which comes in on the back of leftist ideology. Spiritual problems can only be made worse by liberalization, which is actually and always covert apostasy. Insisting upon the non-sexual nature of God does not work either. This is just an attempt to escape contradictions, absences, and by raising abstractions, which has the effect of confusing people, and thereby impairing motivations. Furthermore, the idea and ideals of ultimate transcendence of sexuality point away from Christianity, rooted in Jesus, the divine incarnate mortal man, and towards oneness spirituality, where, eventually, everything merges with everything else, in a timeless stasis. The problem is that it does not really make deep theoretical and theological sense to insert Mary alongside the masculine Trinity, and she is therefore always accorded an ultimately secondary and intercessionary role in creation, no matter how central is her position in everyday worship, e.g. devotion to the Rosary, or Marian icons. But even worthwhile degrees of habitual lifestyle and provision of psychological comfort are insufficient motivations in a world so dominated by evil-affiliated institutions. In our unavoidably self-conscious era, these inner contradictions about Mary have become nigh-lethal to strong Christian faith, as is evident all around us. This is why I regard Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Mariolatry as on the right lines but ultimately insufficient, and unsatisfactory. And, as Ash described, this requisite kind of development can only come from directly apprehended knowledge, it is not already existent. To emphasize, what is required is not something that can honestly be derived from existing scripture, theology or history. Furthermore, it needs to arise bottom-up, which means from individuals, not institutions. If modern men are to grasp and retain the needful structuring focus on resurrected eternal life, if we are to live by knowledge of heaven, then we will need explicitly to discover and embrace what will be new truths of eternal verities concerning women in relation to creation and salvation. In search of courage/motivation. Bruce Charlton. Ever since I began regularly blogging some 15 years ago, I have cycled around this distinctively modern problem of demotivation. Modern Western people are strikingly lacking in powerful motivators, compared with earlier generations, and this is the reason why we are so lacking in courage, so cowardly. The deep reason is obvious enough: our atheism, materialism, our systematically built-in cultural assumption that there is neither purpose nor meaning to life. In a word, our nihilism. In seeking to escape such nihilism, some people turn to ideologies, but, lacking a personal and loving God, these always turn out to be rooted in negative values, hence incoherent, and incoherence cannot provide us with strong and lasting motivations. This is why people just go along with what they perceive, as manipulated by the mass media, to be the flow. Lacking in a motivation, they seek to conform to externally structured and short-termist goals relating to personal gratifications. Lacking in a motivation and ultimate purpose, they have no reason to be courageous. The answer is, of course, Christianity, but exactly what this implies is unclear. All of the major Christian churches are, and nearly all of Christian discourses, nowadays so overwhelmingly corrupt and distorted in emphasis, that to become a Christian is only a very small start down the path of discovering a strong, valid and good motivation for life. One problem is that Christians are told to seek the truth in a church, i.e. to discover and obey the true church, yet Christianity is replete with discourses placed at a level of idealization and detached abstraction, such that whatever was resolved by such procedures could never motivate a flea, and doesn't. This applies to the vast structure of logic and legalism, complex doctrines and dogmas, wranglings over language and translation, ancient history and context, and endless bitter disputes over the valid structures of hierarchy and authority. Consequently, lacking strong motivators, the actual motivations of Christians are just whatever is socially and personally expedient, whatever is most rewarding, least risky, and in general easiest in their particular societal niche. The would-be Christian falls into such mire because he is told always to seek truth and motivation in some external and objective, yet always and necessarily human at the interface, persons and institutions. In other words, there is an assumption built in, from the history of religion and culture, that truth is a thing out there, and that truth ought to impose upon us, our job being merely to let this happen. This assumption talks as if human experience, consciousness, awareness, intuition and insight, had not existence except as distractions. Actual people, particular human individuals, are edited out from it, except as a source of interference. The picture it accepts is one of a human passivity that excludes the essential presence in the description of our distinctive existence as living beings. What people don't realize is that this is not how things are, but it is a theory of knowledge and behavior and life and spirit. As long as we allow ourselves to assume such a theory, then we will always be alienated, because we are not actively participating in the process, can never know truth, because it is out there, and shall never be strongly motivated of ourselves, but only secondarily following some external source of guidance. Even when someone escapes, for a while, from the deadly assumptions of our civilization, and recognizes that the world is not out there but participative, and that motivation must derive from our primary involvement in the creation of reality, then the actual daily/hourly business of being motivated to good remains a present problem. But at least it is a real problem, in which we are primarily and personally concerned, and a problem that involves both us and the world, both us and God. And, after all, this mortal life is a transitional phases, not a thing to be solved. What we should seek is the courage and commitment to keep engaged and keep learning, guided both from within and by our real and creative participation in divine creation. Ultimately, there is no possible division between inner and outer, subjective and external. Reality is inconceivable without a basis that includes both. Yet at the same time we are not immersed in unity, but distinct beings. Our picture of reality should explain how this works. And like the knowledge itself, this is something that is learned by inner participation and engagement in creation. Learning this is not possible when the self is self-expunged, it is not something learned from any conceivable external source. Ourselves must be engaged and participate in the reality outside ourselves. Such knowledge is motivating because we personally and actively know it, and such motivation gives courage. Note added, motivation/courage are therefore a byproduct of solid, Christian, conviction, and not something that can be sought directly. If sought directly, then all that will result is psychological courage, which is a product of external causes interacting with internal disposition, and will only be as strong or lasting as the stability and strength of those external causes and internal disposition. The way to get motivated, and have a reason for courage, is to discover meaning and purpose in a way that is underpinned by personal conviction of personal destiny. What would be better than what Jesus Christ has to offer? Bruce Charlton. God is an answer to the problem of our existence in reality. The Christian God is a personal creator, and as such provides the possibility of purpose and meaning, if we choose to align with the divine. This God loves us each as a parent loves his or her child, and therefore we may have a personal role in creation, as a member of God's loving family. Jesus Christ is an answer to the problem of our life in this world. This actual experienced world is a mixture, life and death, creation and destruction, good and evil, joy and despair, love and fear. Jesus offers the possibility of a life of creation, good, joy and love, forever and unmixed. It seems to me that Jesus' offer is the best I know of, that I can believe. It has one disadvantage, which is that heaven lies on the other side of death. We must first die and be resurrected if heaven is to become possible, if we are to be fitted for heaven, and if heaven and ourself is to become eternal. The only offer that I can imagine which would be better than that of Jesus is if it was possible to provide heaven on earth now and without dying. I don't believe that this is possible. I believe that the nature of this mortal life and world is such that entropy, death and evil are always going to be present. But I imagine that someone who could believe that real, unmixed, everlasting heaven on earth and on this side of death was a genuinely possibility, would probably prefer it to what Jesus offers. In case anybody is interested why I, personally, do not believe heaven on earth is possible, others will reason differently. Of course, the main reason is that I regard the free agency of beings as primary. Unless each and all of the beings on earth and in this universe, i.e. every single being, including the mass of non-human beings, animals, plants, minerals etc., were to choose to live wholly by love, and allow the elimination of everything about themselves that was incompatible with heaven, then there would still be evil present in this world, and heaven could not be made on earth. So much for evil. What of entropy and death? I regard chaos, of autonomous, uncoordinated, unaware of each other beings, as primal, and God's creation as being imposed upon that. While there is no end to God's creating, there is a constant tendency to revert to the primal state, which is termed entropy. So the harmonious cooperation that is creation, is always tending to degenerate, and death is the end of all earthly things, forms, structures, beings. In other words, this is a mortal universe, everything changes, decays, dies, and everlasting life cannot be imposed upon it, cannot, because otherwise, with the Creator as good and personally loving, eternal living would already have happened and be normal. I regard it as a fact of life that we all must therefore die, before we can be remade eternally, from scratch, on the basis only of love, i.e. resurrected. I state my reasons, not to defend or debate them, but because I find them compelling. The point is not to argue about it, but to discover what you find compelling. Siva Siddhanta. William Wildeblood. Most people who are interested in Indian spirituality will be familiar with Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualistic philosophy whose principal exponent is Sankara. This is a profound but flawed system of thought which I have written about on several occasions, chiefly to point out its flaws. See posts under the non-duality label. Advaita was clearly influenced by Buddhism, even though the two were rivals, and one of the reasons for its popularity in the West is that, like Buddhism though not in quite such a dramatic fashion, it does away with God who is reduced to an existent in the relative world, albeit the prime existent. This makes it seem to the unwary, steeped in / corrupted by modern ways of thinking, a deeper analysis of reality than theistic religion. Most Westerners also believe that Advaita is the summation of Hindu thought. The traditionalist school of René Guénon and Fritjof Schumann adopted this approach. In fact, that is not the case. In India, monistic religion precedes theistic religion, which probably arose in reaction to non-duality as its shortcomings became apparent. The qualified Advaita of Ramanuja, which accepts the reality of both the individual soul and God even though the two can be joined in a union of oneness, is one well-known example, and there is also the later and lesser-known example of Siva Siddhanta, the anta suffix signifying the end of something, the conclusion to which it leads, as in Vedanta, which is the end of the Vedas, their culminating point. So Siva Siddhanta is the final word on knowledge about Shiva, who in this system stands for the Supreme God. As a doctrine in codified form, Siva Siddhanta appeared in the 12th century in the south of India with mystical texts that described how the soul, sinful as it is by its own nature, cannot attain liberation except through knowledge of Shiva bestowed by his grace on one who loves him. Love is important as it is not in Advaita, which is all about knowledge. Souls are intrinsically divine but separate themselves from God through egotism, and the impurities or bonds acquired through experience in the material world. Union with the Deity is attained through His grace and is absolute in that there is no sense of separation whatsoever, but even in this union the individual self remains, thereby drawing a clear distinction between this approach and that of the non-dualist. For the Siva Siddhanta devotee, God always has a transcendent aspect even when he is fully realized as immanent, so even in liberation the creator/created relationship remains. God is perceived as the soul of the soul, closer to you than your own self, but he is also infinitely beyond you. This idea is similar to the Christian understanding of the relationship between the soul and God, and the spiritual approach to the deity in this system also has something in common with Christian practice. Shiva, which is simply a name for the supreme first principle or primary person, can only be known through love. This love has 4 stages. The first is that of the good servant towards his master. The second is like the child towards its parents. These tend to imagine God as external, but the following stages see him as within the soul and involve meditation on his perfection. The first is compared to friendship, while the final stage, which brings full knowledge of and oneness with Shiva, is likened to the union of lovers. I have often expressed my conviction that the incarnation had a spiritual effect worldwide, influencing whoever was able to receive it through inner sensitivity. Naturally, the greatest effect would have been through the spread of the knowledge of Christ by missionaries. But in addition to this, Christ entered into non-Christian religions, which may have been culturally resistant to the actual Christian religion, by permeating them with his spiritual being. You can see this with the idea of the Bodhisattva appearing in Mahayana Buddhism in the centuries after Christ, and you can also detect it in the Bhakti movements in both North and South India. I suggest that Siva Siddhanta is an example of this process. I'm not saying that Siva Siddhanta is Christianity in disguise. It is what it is, completely itself, and outwardly has nothing to do with Christianity. Nor am I saying it is exactly equivalent to or equal to Christianity. But the spiritual essence of it can be compared to the essence of Christianity, because Christ has suffused it with his presence and stamped it with the concept of religious love. Christ is only fully present in Christianity, but I contend that he is not entirely absent elsewhere to the degree that other religions are able to open themselves up to his universal spirit. Notice, Barbara Pym continues. Bruce Charlton. A decade ago plus, I wrote a couple of posts about the English novelist Barbara Pym, 1913 to 1980, and this is just to say I have continued to reread these on an approximately 2-year cycle ever since. I never seem to tire of her early novels, and every new reading brings a delight all the greater for being sure and certain. My present encounter is to hear the main 5 of the earliest novels on audiobook, currently Less Than Angels, which would probably be a good first try for anyone interested in exploring her work, since many of the major themes are there. These include high church Anglicans, anthropology, middle-aged spinsters, distressed gentlewomen, and curates, and a large cast of younger people as well. Pym's alter ego, there is always one in each novel, is this time a writer, the bohemian, 30-something author of women's magazine stories. Pym is very much a minority and specialist taste as a writer. It's comedy of manners, based on close observation of foibles and reactions in the minutiae of everyday living. Not much happens. A church jumble sale or a seminar on African languages counts as a big event. But for some people in certain mood, Barbara Pym is just what is wanted, a real treat. How is it that successful, fated, mainstream establishment people nonetheless regard themselves as radicals? Bruce Charlton. The phenomenon by which people who, perhaps, began life as cynical radicals or supposed revolutionaries, later become successful and highly rewarded and decorated bureaucrats, managers, executives, politicians, and committee people, yet still regard themselves as radical, has been noticed, and sometimes mocked, for many decades. It was first apparent after those who had engaged in activism, demonstrations, sit-ins, etc., as students, later went on to join the establishment, to gather prestigious jobs and positions, money, power, awards and medals, and, in the UK, titles such as Sir/Dame/Lord/Lady, but often maintained their younger styles of self-presentation, hair, clothes, sexual lifestyle and the like, but always trumpeting their self-image as anti-establishment, radical, leftist, altruistic, engaged, etc. This is now so normal and near universal as to be expected and largely unremarked. It is now so usual for heads of corporations, professors, and presidents, doctors, lawyers, teachers, executives and managers express themselves as radical and leftist, that this has become mandatory and monitored, part of job applications and promotion procedures, and compulsory training. Anyone who is not explicitly radical and anti-establishment is indeed intentionally excluded from positions of high status, fame, power and wealth. As I said, when this is noticed it is usually to mock, or else to point out the hypocrisy. Yet this phenomenon is, in truth, quite extraordinary and historically unprecedented, therefore we are dealing with a fundamental, and significant phenomenon which demands a structural explanation. To be clear, in the past establishment people supported the establishment. It is very strange indeed that in the West, now and for many decades establishment people desire, and are indeed required, to subvert, destroy, and invert the establishment, starting always with whatever is most good, or most functional, about the establishment. This at first seems like a paradox or contradiction, for people to be destroying the basis of their own success, but it can be explained quite simply at a motivational level. If you imagine that you are a member of an alien civilization, an alien, who is motivated by resentment against another civilization, the establishment, then it makes perfect sense for the alien to both do the best for himself here and now, within the establishment, and also to do so in a way that tends to weaken and destroy the establishment. Personal success is achieved by strategic destruction. If you regard yourself as an alien to the civilization that is your host which you fear and despise, then the best strategic route through life is to behave as a parasite that feeds off the host. Although successful parasites weaken their host, and tend to destroy their own niche, and kill themselves, but if the parasite can evolve faster than the host and has foresight, then each parasite can be continually seeking new niches to exploit. For example, a path to success as a manager is to suck the blood from one organization to one's own advantage, then, just before the institution expires, move on to vampires another. That is precisely how the modern establishment operates, both subjectively, in terms of their motivations, and also objectively in terms of the way that society has become structured as ruled by a managerial bureaucracy mass media. This is what lies behind the so-called long march through the institutions of the New Left. It was not achieved by tens of millions of middle-class people all over the world following the blueprint of an obscure theoretician, but is the natural and inevitable consequence of implementing the inner motivations of the niche-seeking, parasitic post-1960s establishment. Such an explanation makes perfect sense of the self-image and actions of the Western ruling class. So, in what sense are the Western establishment actual and conscious parasitic aliens, given that we are talking here about a large segment of the population? My answer is, in the sense that the establishment are atheist, materialist and hedonic in their fundamental nature and motivations, which means they are opposed to God, divine creation and Jesus Christ in the spiritual war of this world. In simple terms, by adopting ultimate assumptions about reality that are materialist/spirit denying, creation denying, God rejecting, utilitarian, almost the entirety of the ruling class have joined the devil's party, adopted the worldview of demons, and are therefore quite naturally doing the work of Satan. The odd, superficially hypocritical and risible, apparently paradoxical, way in which cynical radicals develop into pillars of the establishment while retaining their self-image and lifestyle as cynical radicals, is actually a diagnostic symptom of the takeover of the West by those who are affiliated to the powers of purposive evil. It is from understanding things in this way that I conclude these are the most evil times in the history of the world. The absurd secular right delusion that the reason for the triumph of the left was a strategic blueprint for the long march through the institutions. Bruce Charlton. Following on from my earlier post, I'd like to add a comment on the absurdity of that oft-repeated claim or insinuation that the undoubted triumph of the new left in the West was planned and driven by some kind of blueprint for a long march through the institutions, a scheme devised by intellectual theoreticians such as Gramsci, Marcuse and their disciples. This is nonsense of a kind that is only possible to those with an inverted understanding of the world. I mean the kind of people who believe that the history of ideas is something caused by top-down influences from the words of philosophers, for instance that the subjective-objective split in modern minds derives from the publications of Descartes, or that the pronouncements of Professor Kant in Königsberg led to the common belief that reality cannot be known directly and therefore everything is relative/a matter of opinion. The kind of people who see the left as a Christian heresy, as caused by Christianity, rather than the truth that the rise of leftism reciprocally mirrored the decline in Christian faith, and that the triumph of leftism was completed only after Western apostasy from Christianity, and the establishment of fully secular social institutions and discourses. The non-religious opponents of mainstream new leftism, or the secular right, are very keen on attributing the triumph of the left to theories and plans, because radical right theorists intend, or at least hope, to use the same kind of strategy to impose their own ideas. That is, the secular right believe that if only they could come up with the correct theoretical strategy, disseminate it sufficiently widely, and then get it implemented, they will be able to influence the West in the direction that they desire. In other words, and this is often stated explicitly, the intent among at least the more radical members of the secular right is to use what they suppose to be the methods of the left, but to redirect them to supposedly right-wing's objectives, leftist means to rightist ends. Aside from the fact that this is an instance of the Boromir strategy, or hey lads, let's use the One Ring to fight Sauron, and therefore will inevitably have the actual effect of promoting the left, this theoretical, top-down, rightism is based on false understandings of the reasons for the triumph of the left. This false understanding of the left derives, ultimately, from the fact that the secular right actually is itself of the left in that it is based in materialist non-religious assumptions, and rooted in values that are psychological, in some version of a utilitarian, and hedonic calculus of gratification and suffering. The only true opposition to the left is religion, and the only true religion of salvation is by following Jesus Christ. But this is a religion not of this world in its essence. Therefore, socio-political theories rooted in denial of a personal creator God, materialism, and exclusion of the spiritual from life, can only do net harm. The reason why we ought not to engage with AI is the same reason we ought not to engage with demons. Bruce Charlton. I don't know whether you have ever felt that somewhat despairing sense of the weariness of mortal men, when engaged with simulated human/pseudo-intelligent AI programming, mechanisms that, very much like demons, do not fatigue, and always comes back at you, again and again, with no end point. This is what chess grandmasters reported feeling, when they first engaged with powerful chess computers, a Terminator-like relentlessness, needing neither rest nor sleep. We humans use up attention, energy, motivation on these interactions, but AI does not. We cannot go on and on, but AI can and does. If we persist in engaging with AI, we shall sooner or later be worn down and yield to it. Perhaps inwardly acknowledging its superiority, or, whether consciously or unconsciously, conforming to its mode of operating, its materialist and mechanical cognition. This is of course one of the primary reasons why we have had AI gratuitously inflicted upon us by the demon-affiliated global establishment, why AI is made to be addictive, and why the spiritual corruption of those human beings who gratuitously engage with and write about AI approvingly, is so very obvious and frighteningly rapid. Note, on the other hand, every single time we discern this demonic reality of AI, when we recognize the evil temptation, and inwardly reject it, we have learned a spiritual lesson, and we have made spiritual progress. So our current situation is not all bad. Not if we take the opportunity to discern, and repent when needed, and learn from experience. Such is the nature of this mortal life. Unlike the Borg, our resistance to evil is not futile, because resistance is part of the point of this phase of existence. Why Christian knowledge must be derived directly, not externally. Francis Berger. I have argued that the future of Christianity lies in direct knowledge rather than submissive obedience to external sources of Christian authority, or any authority. This does not entail that all sources of external Christian authority must be indiscriminately jettisoned. However, such external sources should be regarded as secondary concerning matters of knowing that must be tested against direct knowledge. External sources are information sources, meaning they are sources of secondary thought. Left to their own devices, they do little but form thought. As such, sources of secondary thinking are truth as knowledge of reality, while primary thinking is truth as reality itself. Secondary thinking is the objective and external imposing upon the knowledge-seeking subject via reflections or symbols. Primary thinking, on the other hand, is more akin to the creative discovery of the subject within encountering the subject out with, igniting the sort of knowledge that results in a non-symbolic and creative transfiguration of reality. The significance of direct knowledge over secondary knowledge is particularly pressing in this time and place, with its ubiquitous mass/social media, and the advent of AI, yet even strict reliance on long-trusted external sources like the Bible no longer fully serves, as demonstrated by the blogger below who, 4 years ago, argued that Christians have no legitimate opposition to the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. How did said blogger reach such definitive conclusions? Through secondary Christian sources and secondary thinking, of course.